The tile under his feet clanged like a bell. A polished shoe struck a puddle of floor cleaner. A silence snapped as if someone had pressed pause, and the boardroom, full of voices softened to stunned gasps, shrank down to the size of a single urgent sound, the thud of hands on a chest. Bernard Kellerman's palms knew the rhythm before his mind did. Years of being the person who showed up, school events, broken pipes at night, scraped knees, a childhood CPR class half remembered and now suddenly crucial, had taught him how to move when others froze. He crouched, felt the corner of the heavy conference table dig into his elbow, and counted out compressions in a steady whisper. 1, 2, 3. The room blurred. Chrome, glass, the expensive hush of a company that had spent a fortune on the illusion of control. For a moment, the disparity between his work-worn hands and the silk cuff that trembled under his fingers was all he could see. She was breathing raggedly, eyes fluttering like curtains in a storm. Alexandra Ashcroft, 46, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and headlines that praised her acumen, had been laughing at the end of a long deal and then dropped as if someone had cut the wire holding her upright. The floor's red carpet swallowed her heels. Her blonde hair fanned across the polished wood. The CEO's chair scraped back. A cup slid and spilled. People recoiled in choreographed ways, the sort of choreography that had been rehearsed for scandal and bad press, but not for a man on his knees trying to buy time with his hands. "Call 911, someone shouted. Very quickly, there was the mechanical rustling of suit jackets, the squeak of a cell being fished out of a pocket. A security guard barked orders. Phones rose like metal flowers. A video began to live in the cloud before the paramedics even arrived. Bernard had been hired that morning on a temp contract, 2 months covering a maternity leave, sweeping luxury dust behind million-dollar decisions. He was supposed to be invisible. He had been invisible for most of his life by design, cheaper to overlook than to understand. He cleaned the fingerprints off a glass that also carried the fingerprints of people who couldn't imagine a life of making rent on time. He watched the city through janitor closet windows and learned to move like a shadow, present only long enough to do the job and vanish before recognition could attach to him. But that day the room asked for his hands. He pressed until his shoulders burned, until the beat of his palms matched the frantic strobing of the fluorescents. He tilted her head, sealed his mouth over hers for the rescue breaths taught in a community class when he learned CPR so he could be prepared for his daughter, Molly, when she started school. In that class, the instructor had said, "You never know when you'll be the one who has to step forward." He had taken that sentence home like a prayer. Phones kept filming.
Someone's finger recorded a shaky, vertical video of a man in a fluorescent vest, lips white with concentration, working to keep the breath inside a woman whose name would come to mean headlines and lawsuits and 1,000 op-eds. Another phone flashed a close-up of his hands on her sternum, and a caption was born in a split second: "Janitor attacks CEO." The catch meant nothing to Bernard in that moment. He had a child's face in his mind, Molly's freckled nose, the way she hummed when she stacked blocks, thinking of how he'd run home to her if she needed him. That image kept his hands steady. Paramedics arrived, and the medical world slid into the room with practiced, non-judgmental violence. A bag valve mask, a defibrillator rolled like a reluctant confession. Someone in a black suit gave instructions that sounded like orders from a different life. A doctor at the hospital would later explain the clinical phrase, sudden cardiac arrest. But right there, in that sheen of panic, Bernard did what had to be done. He handed her over when the professional said his part was finished. He tasted antiseptic and the particular metallic tang of adrenaline, and felt the last of his certainty peel away. People whispered. Someone asked him to step aside for security. He stepped because his hands still hurt, and because he trusted the professionals to carry on. The first headline arrived before the parking lot emptied. It wasn't a headline in a newspaper spread. It was the kind of headline that skews perception faster than any journalist can correct. A cropped frame from a vertical video, accentuated by a lurid caption, spread across platforms that vaulted rumor into conviction. The angle made the scene look grotesque, Bernard looming over Alexandra, his body an ambiguous mass. The top comment read, "What was he doing to her?" and the sentence grew like fungus. Inside the boardroom, decisions made in minutes would echo for weeks. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, hands always dry, voice practiced in the softer forms of denial, asked security to detain the janitor until they were certain of what had happened. The boardroom that had applauded Alexandra's strategies just an hour before shuffled as if to displace responsibility. "We must act decisively to protect our leadership and our brand." The legal team circulated phrases like potential liability and image management. A junior PR person began drafting a statement about a disturbing incident that acknowledged concern without accepting culpability. Bernard left with his badge dangling, an envelope of final pay placed in his palm like a notice rather than a thank you. He walked back to the service elevator, past the employees who met his eye with a flash of the private calculation that had been taught by 1,000 news cycles. A line with power. The man on the floor is always less visible than a woman in a suit. He felt the slipperiness of shame even though he had done the right thing. He had acted.
He had given air and compressions and time. He had saved a life, and still he was escorted out. By the time the ambulance lights faded into the city's skin, a different kind of machinery had begun. Image crafting, rumor fueling, narrative sculpting. The story that spread needed someone to blame before more complicated truths could unsettle it. Bernard's name was an easy shape to pour into the mold. That night his apartment smelled like leftover pasta and laundry detergent. Molly, 7, and Ernest, set her stuffed rabbit between her knees and hummed that small rhythm he recognized from when she was learning piano. The sound had the effect of a lighthouse. It anchored him, reminded him of the reason for the steady hands. He sank onto the narrow couch, his uniform still smelling faintly of cleaning solution. Janet Holloway, his neighbor, and a kind of unpaid second grandmother, stood in the doorway holding a casserole dish she wouldn't leave for long. "You okay?" Janet asked, not as a question but as the constant evaluation of someone who had watched him keep his head above water for years. He told her, simply, "I did what had to be done." Janet's eyes narrowed in that gentle way older women have when they weigh an injustice. "They turned it into something else already," she said. Her phone showed him the headline, the cropped video, the bold caption, the thousands of retweets. "They're calling for charges." Bernard swallowed. The thought that his hands might swing him into a criminal record made the air heavy. He called the agency that had hired him. Corporate HR said he'd be suspended pending investigation. He was told, in the most bureaucratic tones, that their decision was in the company's best interest. Later that night, a man from security drove by to deliver a formal termination letter to his apartment. The paper smelled of formal closure, more like a seal than a conversation. It explained the process and concluded with the legal ease that always read like finality, unless you had a lawyer. Molly didn't fully understand why Daddy was quiet at dinner. She asked if they could still get the ice cream she loved. He promised he would try. He filed away discussions of eviction tabbed for the coming month like a future he could not yet inhabit. He slept on the couch that night with one eye open, as if the city's smearing glare might find him in his rented room. The world, he had learned, could be more eager to punish a person than it was to ask how she had been saved and who had made that saving possible. Back at the penthouse, the mechanics were different, but the effect, of shock, was the same. Alexandra had come into the meeting that day prepared for a negotiation that would tighten her company's hold on a market segment. She loved being the person who could reduce complexity to a line item, who could direct the course of others with a simple phone call. She was also a mother. The word mom sat behind her other titles like a quieter, less public warmth. She worried, in that private way successful people do, about who would have the right influence on her children's futures. Perhaps this is what made the image of a stranger kneeling over her chest feel both disorienting and intimate. In the early hours, she woke in the hospital to the sterile light, a nurse's voice explaining that she had been lucky. Later, back at her place, surrounded by assistants who moved like ghosts, she tried to reassemble the memory and found it missing pieces. She relied on the narrative fed to her by security and PR, an unclear incident, an investigation, a misplaced hand. She wanted to accept that the company's reaction had been measured. The idea of being at the center of a breach of trust, of a man violating her space, was a comfortable story because it allowed her to remain safely in control of the fallout. Her dreams, however, were not easily governed. They pushed at her like incoming tide. A man's hands on her chest repeated in fragments, Molly's humming transposed into something else, cameras in her mouth. She woke in the night feeling as if the room had been dressed in someone else's accusation. Something about the way she slept after the incident was sleep with a thin film across it. Small disturbances became unbearable magnified, the same way a single scratch seemed to run a whole fabric. It would be days before she would see the surveillance footage on her own. At first, she didn't look closely. She let the people charged with smoothing the narrative circulate their statements. Tyler Brigham sent memos about security protocols, about swift response, about minimizing risk. Words that meant policy to him sounded like absolution to some of the board. But private unrest crept under her public statements. A line in her stomach tightened whenever she thought of the man who had been removed from the building, of the way a door had closed on him like a final stamp of irrelevance. In a moment that would pivot everything,
She asked Fiona, her assistant, to pull all related footage. "I want to see everything," she said in the kind of quiet that silenced a room. The request was small but fateful. It had the unremarkable quality of an executive asking for a briefing, and yet it was a gate she had not thought to open before. Fiona fetched the file, the raw video from security cameras, and put it on a screen in Alexandra's private study, where mahogany and soft light attempted to reassure her of permanence. She watched the footage at a strange angle. From above, the room looked like a chessboard of bodies. She saw the edges of the conference table, a drink spilling, a human silhouette collapsing. She saw Bernard enter in his jacket and vest, hands already in motion. He had ducked about the chairs, navigated legs, and dropped to his knees without hesitating.
The camera's clarity stole the ambiguity the cropped social post had created. It showed the compressions, the breaths, the way he held her jaw so her airway would remain open. It showed his face, concentrated in gray, not in a predatory way, but in the stubborn, urgent geometry of someone refusing to let a life slip away. Alexander watched until the image extended beyond pixels to something ethical and raw. When the footage ended, she sat in the hush like someone who had read a verdict she hadn't expected to hear. A confession uncoiled inside her. For the first time since the ambulance had taken her, she felt a concrete, personal guilt toward the man who had been branded the villain. The company had acted before it knew. The board had been quick to distance themselves, to preserve brand integrity. That language now felt faintly obscene. She thought of children, her own, and the way parents scramble to build safety for them, the way public image can be a shield until it isn't. She thought, too, of the sound of a mop bucket, the tiny footfalls in a hallway, the life of a person who rarely receives public acknowledgement. She watched the footage again. She needed to be certain. Bernard had a little smudge of oil on his sleeve, his knuckles worn from work. He had saved her life. The realization moved inside her like heat. You can talk yourself into 1,000 rationalizations, especially when your privilege has taught you the language of plausible deniability. But watching that man place his hands on her turned her private nerves into a public moral dilemma. She felt an anger that surprised her, at the company's reflexes, at Tyler and his cohort who had leapt to protect a narrative rather than a human being, at herself for trusting that corporate mechanisms would do the right thing. That anger was not performative. It had the shape of responsibility. When the first smear posts began to circulate, edited, weaponized, and ravenous, Alexandra found she couldn't live with the thought that a single image, cropped to cruelty, could ruin a man's life. She pictured Bernard's daughter humming in an apartment where maybe the heat was turned low to save on bills, feeling an old, almost animal need to protect those small domestic sanctuaries, hers and others. She made a decision bottled in urgency. It would be private at first, not for press screens or op-ed columns. She told Fiona to find him. The search was more complex than she expected. The man had been escorted away. Records were a maze of agency contact info and confidentiality clauses. Tyler's office called but was brushed aside by Alexandra's own sharp refusal. She wanted the man found, not as a PR token, but because she felt a debt she could not calculate with money. She wanted to make sure he was okay. That language, make sure he is okay, was both personal and embarrassingly inadequate for someone used to changing markets.
Fiona returned hours later with an address: Bernard Kellerman, 3rd floor walk-up on the east side. Across town, in a cramped apartment with framed drawings of sunflowers crooked on the wall, Bernard sat on his couch with a hard packet of paperwork on the coffee table, his termination letter, a bank notice, and a threat of an eviction hearing. He tried to sleep with Molly's small feet pressed to his side, but he did not fall. He kept one ear tuned to the city. News kept mutating around him. Online, camera angles and meme juries passed judgment without courtroom or testimony. He felt as if he had been reduced to the shape of a story someone else wanted to tell. He had options that were thin. He could call an attorney, but he had never had enough money to sustain the kind of prolonged legal fight that might rescue him from a giant narrative. He could protest publicly and try to speak his truth, but the social algorithm had already favored the viral moment, and counter-narratives take time he did not have. He had to think of Molly, of her lunch money and winter coat, of the dentist appointment in 2 months that now seemed fanciful. He had to think about dignity for both of them. Janet tried to help. She took Molly for a weekend, she left leftovers, she counted change into mugs and offered them like a neighborly liturgy. They organized a small fundraiser on a well-meaning local page, but the smear campaign did more than threaten their bank account. It made him small again in the eyes of people who had once seen him as reliable, as forgettable in the polite way the world does to those who keep it running. He refused to become an object in someone else's redemption story. When Alexander's assistant called with the address, an agent knocked on Bernard's door with a name and a badge. He expected the worst, more inquiries, more paper, but instead found a woman in a suit who offered a quiet apology and a hand extended in the awkward language of power trying to be tender. "She wants to help you," Fiona said, without the rehearsed pitch of PR. It was a simple sentence, and Bernard felt the tilt of the world change slightly. He was wary. There are favors and there is agency. He had not been taught to trade his dignity for a casserole. Somewhere between refusal and acceptance is negotiation. Bernard listened. Fiona spoke of medical bills potentially covered, temporary housing, and a job offer. The words were a slippery mix of what could be support and what could be charity. Bernard thought of Molly and the winter coat that would mean more to a child than any press statement. He also thought of the invisible line that runs between gratitude and subservience. He wanted to be treated like a man who had earned respect, not a recipient of handouts. He made a choice that would define the contours of his life now. He would accept help that preserved his voice.
He would not be the small man in the glossy story unless he kept control of what being saved meant. That night, he sat across from Fiona at a small kitchen table, the light from the stove hood a halo over everyday things. He accepted a temporary offer of shelter for Molly and himself, and a meeting to discuss a formal job. But he insisted on other things too. A commitment that his termination would be re-examined, that he would be given the opportunity to speak to a neutral mediator, and that any public narrative about the incident would include an accurate account of what had happened. Fiona took notes, her expression shifting from the professional opacity of an assistant to something more human as she realized this possibility might be real. "I'll make sure this is put forward," she assured him. "She wants to make it right." For a moment, there was relief, but the relief came with a caveat. Tyler Brigham had already begun to mobilize. He could not afford a string of apologies to undo a narrative that had, in his estimation, been necessary to protect assets. He began to whisper to other executives about preemptive litigation and proactive counsel. He leaked memos hinting that Bernard had made inappropriate contact with the CEO, phrasing that resembled a threat more than an account. Bernard felt the press of those men like a weather front. He knew that apologies could be retracted. He knew how fast power could redirect compassion into clauses. He also knew he wasn't alone. The neighborhood rallied. The small network of people who show up at bake sales and school plays began to murmur. There were hand-lettered signs on the local notice board and a single article in a community paper that made the case for nuance. But the viral machine loved speed and certainty, and his truth was messy. Alexandra watched the ripple she'd started. She saw Tyler's memos, the protective language that believed its own rhetoric. She saw the ways in which the company's defense had adopted a posture that made the accused invisible once more. It turned her stomach. Watching the man who'd saved her life become a narrative casualty unsettled her to the point of action. She had enough resources to change things, but had to decide how to do it without trampling the man who had been hurt by those same resources. When she visited the hospital under a veil of private motive, no press, no entourage, she watched Bernard from a distance the first time. Him, small in a chair, a hand on Molly's knee, chapped fingers and a face that had been pressed by shame and now by resolve. She watched him speak with Fiona, watched him negotiate without humiliation. Guilt nodded into something more responsible. The conviction that this accident had exposed a structural failure. How quickly a company could weaponize an image to protect profit, and how little it cared for the human beings who worked in its hallways.
She thought of how power can protect itself reflexively, often at the expense of the vulnerable. She knew the language of reform, the speeches, the policies, that could be written to do the right thing in private and in public. And she began to wonder whether her intervention should be more than charity. The idea settled inside her like an impossible lever. What if a personal gesture could force institutional accountability? What if gratitude could be converted into a public binding commitment to change? But she also felt foolish and dangerous. A woman of her privilege proposing marriage to the man who had saved her, offering a private solution to a public problem, would be read as an act of vanity or a PR stunt. The thought itself was alarming, but the logic that kept returning was not about romance. In her mind, marriage could be a way to make the commitment tangible, to bind her reputation to the reforms she would promise. It was a thought born of desperation and moral urgency, not romantic calculation. Bernard, to his credit,
had no idea that in the glass towers, the conversations had turned strange and personal. He only knew that his life had been subjected to a kind of fast and brittle judgment, and that the one person whose life he'd likely saved had been caught up in a corporate title poll. He did not want to be a prop in anyone's story. The city kept humming. Molly's small humming became a drumbeat in his ears, a test for decisions. He agreed to a temporary apartment, with bright walls and a window that let in a sliver of sky. He started, tentatively, to imagine a future that had space for dignity. He went to a local clinic for a checkup because the adrenaline had come back in waves at night, and he wanted to be sure the work of saving someone hadn't cost his own health. Outside, the smear campaign continued. Even as small pockets of support started to coalesce online. People who had worked with him whispered on community boards about his kindness, about the time he'd fixed a neighbor's heater, about Molly's birthday cakes with lopsided icing. But the louder narratives still shouted, was it assault? Was it criminal? The internet had decided that the story was easier when it had a villain and a victim. Complexity bored audiences. The narrative tension kept building like the pressure in a kettle. Alexandra saw the damage she might have done by letting corporate reflex decide first. She'd watched Bernard leave the building, watched public opinion run amok. The footage made things clear, and yet she hesitated to step into the storm herself, worried her intervention could be misinterpreted. In the end, it was not bravado that moved her to act, but the music of that child's humming lodged in her head. She had a child of her own, and the image of Bernard's daughter in a cold apartment was a catalytic, almost unbearable thing. So she called him. Or rather, an assistant called. The company had boundaries.
Bernard almost hung up when he saw the number, but he remembered his earlier insistence that any help he accepted should not erase his voice. He listened to a request. Would he meet her in a private room to talk about next steps? He could have refused. He could have demanded public apology first. He chose instead to step into the room with a cautious openness. He wanted to know what help meant. The first conversation with Alexandra was awkward, in the way of two people who had been strangers to each other's humanity. She spoke about responsibility. He spoke about dignity. The space between them was not romance, but negotiation, and the stakes felt like a moral ledger being balanced in real time. They were two people whose lives intersected like lines in a blueprint, each affecting the other in ways that neither could control alone. By the end of the week, arrangements had been made. Temporary housing for Bernard and Molly, an offer to cover medical bills, and a small private stipend to keep them afloat. The company announced a neutral review of the termination, but for the public it released only the minimal statement about an ongoing inquiry. Tyler insisted to the press that appropriate steps were being taken. Tyler's eyes met Alexandra's across the table with a chill that disguised itself as efficiency. He would not tolerate instability in the company's image. Bernard accepted the shelter because his daughter slept without waking the first night in a quiet place, where the radiator didn't clank like a temper. He accepted because he had to choose what was best for the child who hummed his courage into being. He kept his voice and his insistence that when help came, it should not come as charity that ate into pride. He wanted accountability too, not just remediation for his own loss of income, but a promise that the company would change how it treated workers who didn't have power. Meanwhile, the online smear assumed a new shape. Rumors of a hush agreement. Commentators assumed that someone had bought his silence. The word bought flattened every complexity into a binary. The supporters who had whispered kind things were drowned out by the roar of cynicism. It was one more example of how the internet wanted stories tidy and ancient. Bernard watched as he was reshaped by collective impatience. But the private negotiations had consequences. Fiona smiled with relief when a small grant was cleared. Janet breathed easier when she saw the deposit hit Bernard's account. For the first time in days, Bernard felt a strange, skeptical hope. It was not unfettered. He had been cautious and insisted in firm tones that any commitment from Alexandra must include a structural element, a review of the company's security protocols, transparent investigation procedures, and provisions to protect employees from snap judgments that could cost them their livelihoods. Alexandra listened.
She had power in ways Bernard did not, and with power came the ability to promise and to create policy. She wondered, privately, whether a personal pledge would be enough to force meaningful change. The idea of making a promise that could be legally tethered was an intriguing one. For her, the moral calculus had shifted from guilt to a desire for concrete restitution. She began to speak of measures that could change workplace culture, including a worker advocacy panel and an employee welfare. Tyler, when told, bristled. "We cannot be seen to capitulate," he warned. "We have to control the narrative." It was a fight for the soul of the company.
and the company had always liked neat conclusions. Bernard pressed on, because he could already see how many lives were folded into the margin of corporate safety netting. Cleaners, security guards, contract workers, people who kept the building functioning without ever receiving a line in an annual report. He wanted something that would acknowledge them without turning them into a story for headlines and nothing more. As the week closed, there was a quieter pressure in the air. The community had rallied to feed them, the temporary housing provided small relief, and the case of the man who had been called a criminal and then revealed to be a savior had begun to unfurl across scales of empathy and cynicism. Boards met, memos were passed, and social platforms argued. Bernard's voice grew firmer when he spoke with community organizers and with a small gathering of workers who wanted a platform to discuss dignity and rights in a workplace that often mistook silence for consent. Just when the story seemed to be moving towards institutional answers, a new tremor arrived. Leaked audio of Tyler in the early hours, talking about counsel and controlling damage. The leak made a rumor of a rumor. It hardened some sympathies and hardened others into cynicism toward the corporation. The battle lines emerged between those who saw Alexandra as a leader trying to make amends and those who saw her as the kind of figure who would apologize publicly but fail privately among the boardrooms. There was an undercurrent, too, of something more intimate in Alexandra's behavior. The footage had unsettled her sense of self so deeply that she began to consider gestures she would have once dismissed as dramaturgy. A late-night conversation with Fiona led her to a private thought. What if, by offering something profoundly personal, she could anchor her public promise with a private stake? It was in that small, terrifying coalescence of guilt, fear, and desire for accountability that the impulse towards an unconventional proposal took root, not as theatrics, but as a mechanism to ensure that the reform she promised could not be washed away in easy corporate language. Bernard, unaware of the private calculus roiling in an executive suite, continued to do the small, steady things that had always been his practice.
He took Molly to the clinic. He held her hand in the temporary apartment, and he rehearsed lines he might say to a panel if given the chance to speak. He began to meet with other building staff. They talked about uniform policies and incident reporting, about camera placement and the power of a single edited clip. He began to think of himself less as a man buffeted by headlines and more as someone who could, perhaps, help create a system that stopped the next wrongful accusation before it began. The city is a place of margins and center points. For every camera pointed at a scandal, there are rooms, kitchen tables, hospital wards, where people rearrange the debris of happenstance into survival. Bernard and Molly lived near those margins, but the day would come when a decision made in a private room could either uplift those margins or leave them where they begin. When Alexandra told Fiona to prepare for a meeting in which she would make good, she did not yet know the shape the gesture would take. It could be a check, it could be a set of policies, it could be words read into the record. Or in a late moment that felt reckless and driven by the need to secure a promise with a personal covenant, she considered an offer so stark it might force public accountability in a way a press release never could. But decisions made in the dark are not yet actions. The board's machinery hummed. Tyler sharpened his language. A smear campaign found new bait. Bernard kept cleaning, kept parenting, kept remembering how his hands had found a rhythm that had mattered. He was, in the simplest meaning of the word, visible to the few who loved him. To the many, he remained, for now, invisible. And yet, the reverberation of one small, vital act, the placement of 2 hands on a stranger's chest, the counted compressions, the breath given back, had started to reconfigure the lives it touched. The question that would come to bind them all was not whether she had been saved. It was how to make sure the man who had saved her would be seen in full and not merely as a footnote in a story someone else wished to control. If this story is striking something inside you and you want to follow how it unfolds, what choices will be made, and what those choices will mean for one father, his daughter, and the corridors of power, subscribe and stay with us until the next chapter. For now, however, the scene was set but not resolved. The company had offered crumbs of assistance and called it procedure. Community hands pushed back. Tyler circulated counsel against public exposure. Alexandra sat in her private study, the same footage looped in her mind,
and drafted a list of measures that felt both necessary and insufficient. She could pay, she could promise, she could legislate changes inside a company, but none of those options alone addressed the moral texture of what had happened. An instinctive act of courage, maligned by a world that moved faster to suspicion than to gratitude.
A week after the boardroom incident, an assistant rang Bernard's buzzer and handed him an envelope stamped with the company's seal. He expected another statement, or perhaps a polite dismissal. Instead, he found an invitation, a confidential meeting, an offer to discuss terms of employment, and a review of his termination. Attached was also, curiously, an offer of temporary aid for Molly's school needs, and a line item about long-term support pending review. He read it twice. The envelope was, in essence, a pivot point disguised as a polite corporate act. That evening, as Molly hummed and planned what to draw next, Bernard folded the paper and kept it as if it were something fragile and important. The world outside continued to argue its versions of the truth, but inside a small apartment, the human quiet settled in the spaces between the headlines. He would go to the meeting. He would ask questions, and he would not give away what he owed his daughter for a fleeting comforter or to smooth a public furor. The hour when decisions begin to look inevitable is often quiet, not the clamorous theater of town halls, but a low hum of traffic, a cup cooling on a windowsill, a child's small breath kept in rhythm. It was in that quiet that Alexandra, in the marble hush of her home, began to imagine a commitment that would be public and persistent. It was in that quiet that Bernard considered what dignity would look like if it were guaranteed not by a check, but by a change in the system that had made him invisible. The next move would come from a place of pain and of power, an impulsive plea carried by someone who had been humbled by near death, and who wanted to make restitution in a way that could not be easily undone. The plea would be electric, impossible to ignore, and the reply would be more consequential than either of them could anticipate. What would be asked in that moment, and what would be required in response, would not be merely personal. It would demand a reckoning with the structures that had enabled the harm. It would force them to decide whether to let the moment become a headline, or to let it become a hinge for lasting change. The day for the public announcement had the brittle hush of an event where every word had already been rehearsed into armor. Alexandra moved through the backstage corridor with the precision of someone accustomed to marching into storms prepared. She had written the speech twice, trimmed it, and then trimmed it again until it looked less like an apology and more like a plan, a worker advocacy council, a funded welfare trust, transparent incident review procedures, binding promises, and an external auditor. She had summoned legal counsel to craft wording that could survive scrutiny. She had even, privately, signed off on budget lines that would make the promises more than rhetoric. Tyler watched from the wings like a man guarding a ledger. He had already built contingencies intended to preserve the company's image and the board's comfort. He had argued for careful press cooperation, for staged footage, for a narrative that emphasized hearing all sides. He had drafted denials intended to neutralize any suggestion that the company had been wrong. For weeks, his default had been to shorten the moral sentence into a legal one, ambiguity, then mitigation. Bernard sat near the back of the packed room, Molly asleep in his lap beneath a well-meaning donated blanket. Janet had driven them and taken the seat next to him, a small anchor. The room was a theater of industry, executives in navy suits, community organizers in scarves and worn shoes, local reporters with notepads, and building staff, security, custodial, reception, whose presence signaled the company had at least invited the people it affected. The air smelled like a mix of fresh coffee and printer ink, bitter and sharp. When Alexandra took the stage, the murmurs quieted. She spoke with the measured cadence of a leader used to being listened to. She acknowledged the incident, the footage, the errors in rapid corporate response. She introduced the reforms, an independent incident board with worker representation and veto power over punitive measures affecting contract staff, a funded employee wellness program, a guarantee of reinstatement and back pay for anyone unfairly terminated pending transparent review, mandatory training in bystander protection and PR obligations. She did not offer platitudes. She offered terms. For a few minutes, the room was held by the gravity of policy. Then someone in the press asked about Tyler's memos, about the leaked counsel and the language suggesting preemptive legal posturing. Tyler, perhaps predictably, tried to redirect. The question landed like a stone. Murmurs rose. Someone from the seats shouted about the viral clip and how easy it had been to weaponize a moment. The conversation threatened to return to the old script, counterclaims, quiet retractions, a damage-controlled arc. Alexandra wanted to close that loop. She wanted to cut off the thread of speculation before it could be reknitted into denial. She had rehearsed legal stipulations and compliance checks, but something else had been building all week, a rawness, the image of a child's humming, the chest-tight realization that the man who had saved her life had been shunted aside so swiftly by systems designed to protect reputation. Words alone had not satisfied the itch of guilt.
She felt suddenly that there had to be emotion that made her personally accountable in a way a policy couldn't be. Something unmistakable, a stake pinned to her name so that future backsliding would be visible. She stepped away from her podium, the microphone catching a short intake of breath. The room leaned forward. "Bernard," she said, and her voice, for a moment, had the unpolished tremor of someone who hadn't ironed the edges out of what she felt.
Would you come up here?" A ripple. Bernard felt every head turn. He looked at Janet, then at Molly, who squinted awake as if sensing a change in the atmosphere. He rose slowly. He had practiced nothing for this moment, except the steadying breath a speaker borrows from the public roughness of life. He climbed the steps to the stage, palms slightly clammy, his vest a simple badge against the corporate navy. People murmured. A camera found him and held the frame, as if it were a moral question in a rectangular outline. Alexandra stood near him now, smaller in an unexpected way. The weight of the room's eyes was nothing compared to something else, the private ledger of conscience that had been gathering interest since she had watched the footage. The impulse that had been whispering in her for days, the impulse toward a visible personal pledge, became louder, and in a single uncalculated second, it leapt. Please marry me," she said. The words landed in the air, bright and ridiculous and utterly human. It was not phrased as a demand. It came from a place that was rawer than calculation. She was not proposing matrimony as a shortcut to moral repair, so much as she was trying to pin her future reputation to something she could not easily retract. She imagined, in a naive but urgent way, that a personal covenant might be harder to unwind than a board motion. The room did not know how to breathe. Cameras stilled in fascination. A murmur became a hum of confusion and gossip. Tyler's jaw tightened, as if the muscles of the company's control mechanism had been slapped by a small, unexpected wind. Bernard felt the heat of all those eyes, and Alexandra's plea rose like a banner of her vulnerability. He felt the feeling a man feels when an uninvited intimacy is laid before him, not hostile, but heavy with expectations he had not asked to carry. For a heartbeat, he thought of the private ledger of his own life. Molly's small socks in the wash, Janet's casserole, often given and never repaid, the fear of eviction, his insistence that any help preserve his dignity. He also thought of the way change could be coerced into a personal narrative that left systems intact. He remembered Tyler's memos, the way institutional reflex had been to protect a brand before people. The offer, no matter how sincere, skittered across a line he had drawn the night he took the temporary apartment. He would not be the man to be bought or bound into silence by another person's debt. He could feel the room leaning toward a dramatic answer. The cameras expected a soundbite. Alexandra's face, when she watched him, was unguarded. There was remorse, fear, and a kind of hope that made her look almost childlike. She had, in a way she did not yet understand, made him into the center of a story the world would simplify into romance or scandal.
He steadied himself, and in a voice that surprised him by how calm it sounded, he said, "I'll consider what you're asking, but on one condition." The pause that followed tightened the room like a string instrument bracing for the next note. Alexandra's expression shifted from hope to attentive caution. The cameras intensified their hunger, reporters adjusted pens, Tyler's eyes narrowed to a blade. Bernard kept his eyes on Alexandra and then on the crowd that had arrived to watch the institution bend its knee. "If we're going to make this about me," he said, "then make it about the people who don't have a podium. I will consider marriage only if you make your promises legally binding, today, in front of these people. Not just words, not just a trust fund, a legally enforceable change. An independent employee council with the power to veto terminations of contract workers, a public commitment to reinstate anyone wrongfully fired with back pay and without non-disclosure strings, binding oversight by an external auditor, and the removal of anyone who orchestrated the smear campaign. If that document is signed, if the company implements it, and an independent trustee is appointed to oversee compliance, then we talk about anything else. Until then, no." The room held on those words. It was not a refusal delivered with scorn. It was instead the kind of moral calculus Bernard had rehearsed in quieter rooms with Janet. If you're going to ask a person to bind their life to yours,
bind it to a promise that will lift others, not to a private safety net. The reaction was immediate and electric. A few in the crowd cheered, others hissed. Tyler's hand tightened on a folder in his lap. Alexandra's face shone a flash of something like awe turned inward. She had not expected this. The impulse that had driven her to offer marriage had been personal and reactionary. Bernard's demand reframed that impulse into an imperative for structural change. Her mind raced, trying to translate what she heard into legalese, into budget lines, into deeds and signatures. For the first time, the cameras were not simply looking for scandal, they were looking for a document. "That's not how," Tyler began, the corporate grammar of his objection shaping like a formal letter. "Stop," Alexandra said, and her voice surprised Tyler. She had rehearsed lines about due process and the measured cadence of careful leaders. She had not expected the moral clarity of someone with less power to cut through the rehearsed strategies. She looked at Bernard, and something like surrender passed between them. Not surrender as defeat, but surrender as admission. She had been wrong to rely on systems that could be weaponized so quickly. The plea had been mindless until now. This condition made it into a lever. "If you make that legally binding, here and now, I'll sign," she said. There was a collective intake of breath that felt like a small gale.
Behind the stage, an aide fumbled with a briefcase and produced a stack of papers, legal pads, and an external counsel's card. Alexandra had not fully expected to be pushed into immediate action. She had wanted to control the release, but Bernard's condition had turned the private into public usefully. The sincerity of the offer would be tested not by vows but by deeds. Tyler was furious. He rose to protest, to ask for due process, for board approvals, for the slow, polite machinery of corporate governance. He spoke of precedents and risk, and the legal exposures of binding policies enacted outside governance channels. Yet in the static of his speech, the moral clarity of the moment persisted. The plan Bernard outlined could not wait for corporate committees to roll through months of guarded meetings, while people lost rent and reputations. Fiona, who had been watching from the side with an expression that had become increasingly human over the weeks, stepped forward with an envelope. She had, in the quiet insistence of someone who worked with truth as well as calendars, already consulted an external ethics council retained by Alexandra specifically for this emergency. The council had prepared a draft agreement that could be signed with immediate effect pending board ratification, an instrument designed to be both enforceable and rapid. "It can be structured as a temporary but legally binding injunction," Fiona said quietly. "It can be written to create an independent oversight council with an external trustee appointed today and have the company agree to immediate reinstatement of any unfairly terminated workers pending final review. The board can ratify it later. It carries legal weight now." The legalese would come later. In that moment, the room was asking for a moral move that matched the rhetorical clarity of Bernard's condition. Alexandra, whose life had been made of the slow arithmetic of corporate power, chose to leap. She signed the draft agreement. She signed it with her full name in a trembling hand that belied a resolve that had only hardened in the silence after the footage. Cameras flashed like small bright judgments. Bernard read the document, his eyes scanning lines framed in legal cadence. It was not a perfect instrument, few legal instruments are, but it contained what mattered: binding provisions for worker-led oversight, immediate review of terminations, reinstatement clauses, an independent trustee with authority, and a clause that promised review of conduct for any executive implicated in smear tactics. It named Tyler, in effect, as subject to investigation. More importantly, it placed the company's legal reputation, her reputation, on the line. "Do you agree?" Alexandra asked, the words smaller than the act. Bernard thought of Molly's small freckled nose, of Janet's casseroles, of nights sleeping unquiet with invoices stacked like weather.
He thought of being invisible for most of his life, and suddenly being a hinge for something larger. He thought of dignity, and how it looked when it refused to be purchased and demanded instead to be recognized in law. "Yes," he said, "if it's truly binding, if there's an external trustee, if this creates real oversight, and the people who orchestrated the smear are held accountable." He signed. The signature was an unglamorous thing, a ballpoint scrawl that said nothing about romance and everything about demand. Alexandra, exhausted and relieved and raw, sank into a chair and let out a breath she had been holding for weeks. A reporter's question, "Was it a stunt?" was swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. Somewhere in the crowd, a caretaker began to clap, and then others followed, not in celebration of soap opera romance, but of an unusual public accountability. Tyler swallowed his anger, but the gears turned anyway. The agreement triggered an immediate cascade of legal and administrative motions. An external trustee was appointed, the board scheduled an emergency hearing, and HR reopened files for immediate review. Tyler's email accounts were locked, and in an unusual twist, Marta from legal found troubling redactions in a cache of internal messages that suggested coordinated messaging to discredit contract staff. The company's internal audit tentatively flagged themes that would later be cited as evidence of a smear campaign. It was not immediate justice. Nothing about systems moves quickly,
But the documents that Bernard had insisted upon created a new reality. The company could no longer quietly fold its mistakes into PR language. The story that unfolded after that day was not a neat one. There were legal hearings where Tyler tried to defend the language of protecting leadership, and where emails leaked in ways that made the company's earlier reflexes look worse under bright lights. There were protestations and accusations. Some commentators wrote scathing columns accusing Alexandra of grandstanding. Others praised her for the rare public act of binding herself. The internet did what the internet does best. It split, animated, and quick to judge. But for Bernard and Molly and the people in his neighborhood, the change was more material. Within days, the trustee initiated immediate reviews. The company paid back wages to some contract workers who had been suspended without cause. Reinstatements began in careful, verifiable ways. The new Oversight Council convened its first meeting with workers represented in both voice and voting power. Complaints that once evaporated into HR folders were given timelines and outcomes. Tyler was put on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. Later, as evidence accumulated, he resigned before the board could move and leave the company publicly shamed by the very legal processes he tried to deploy in its defense.
That was not the justice of a public trial, so much as the corporate version of accountability, consequences enacted along the architecture of business and law. Bernard watched it all from within a slower world: school runs, community gatherings, evenings when Molly's tiny hands were laced in his. He began to be summoned to meetings, not as a spectacle, but as a negotiator, a voice for workers who had always been present but rarely heard. There were days when he read the headlines and felt his chest tighten. Sometimes stories flattened nuance into caricature, saying as much about the storytellers as the subject. But there were other days when the names of custodians and security staff were read at meetings, acknowledged, and people thanked in a public ledger that felt like a change larger than a single headline. The program that grew out of the signed agreement became known in staff circles as the Visible Work Initiative. Its language was practical: emergency pay for workers suspended pending review, quick response mediators for incidents involving mixed power interactions, and an employee oath of conduct that included obligations for executives to step aside when allegations of misconduct surfaced. It was not perfect. It could not erase the days Bernard had spent fearing eviction, but it made the system more navigable for the people who had long been pushed to its margins. Alexandra moved differently in public after that day. The shock of the stage plea and the subsequent binding agreement had exposed something in her, a capacity to make her own life vulnerable to a ledger that would not let her hide. She cut back some of the philanthropic theater that had once been her default, and spent long afternoons listening to custodial crews and security teams describe the small indignities of their work. In those rooms, policies were shaped not by PowerPoint, but by stories. She showed up to the first meeting of the Worker Council and sat not as a CEO, but as someone who had made a public promise and wanted to be accountable. Bernard, for his part, refused to be the emblem of a private redemption. He declined the idea of a public romance as a cure-all. He made that clear both in private conversation and in a later, more formal interview, where, after the trustees' initial findings were published, he spoke about the work that remained. "I didn't save the CEO to become a headline," he said to a room of reporters crowded behind a thin velvet rope. "I did it because a child needed her dad. I will not let my name be used to paper over systems that make people invisible." The line landed. People who had been moved by the original scene were forced to face the harder work. Structural reform is less entertaining than scandal, but lasts longer. The Employee Welfare Fund that Bernard helped design had its first grant recipients within months, and it paid for small but essential things: dentistry, childcare subsidies, emergency housing for families facing sudden eviction. Molly, in the meantime, learned to be less startled by cameras. She still hummed the small rhythm that had once anchored her father in the darkest night. The hum became a motif among community members who had watched the family wobble under the weight of headlines and then find a sturdier footing. She made a friend at school and learned to ride a bicycle with slightly better balance. Her world, once tilted by uncertainty, was steadier. There were hard moments. Tyler's allies whispered in corporate corridors that the company's stock had wobbled under the turmoil. There were wakeful nights for Alexandra when analyst messages crowded her inbox. Bernard had nights of doubt too. Not everyone believed that documents alone could produce justice. Some workers were skeptical of any deal that came from the top. But the structure that Bernard insisted upon made room for skepticism.
The council's veto power and the external trustee meant that decisions could be appealed outside corporate spin. Months passed, and small things accumulated into proof. 2 custodial workers who had been suspended were reinstated with back pay, and one was promoted to a supervisory position. The company amended its contractor agreements to include explicit protections against retaliatory termination. The Employee Welfare Fund supported a neighbor who needed an operation. Public narratives shifted from questions about the original incident to conversations about how power had been checked and what it would mean to continue that work. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, months after the stage where Alexandra had blurted her plea, she came to Bernard's temporary apartment with a bag of groceries and a request to talk. There was no audience, no cameras. Fiona had texted the address and asked if they could speak. Molly answered the door first, wearing a new jacket and a grin. Janet hovered behind, perhaps sensing something monumental, but uncertain what shape it would take. They sat at Bernard's kitchen table, the same surface where he'd once signed paperwork with Fiona, and talked not about headlines, but about the slow work of keeping promises. Alexandra listened as Bernard spoke about worker trainings that still needed funding, about a night shift security guard who had been ignored, about the pressure mothers felt when their hours were cut without notice. She took notes with the humility of someone learning a language she had not spoken as a native. After an hour of conversation that resembled negotiation more than confession, Alexandra reached into her bag and produced an envelope. For a moment, Bernard thought of another donation, another check to be accepted with wary thanks.
But inside the envelope was not money. It was a printed document, an amendment she was proposing to the company charter, one that would enshrine worker representation with binding standing and would create a permanent, independent oversight role with statutory protections. "I want to keep my promise," she said, "and I want to make it harder for someone like me to walk away. I know I moved too fast before. I know it looked like a spectacle, but I want to make sure the reform stands without a person, without me, being necessary to keep it in place." Bernard read the pages. It was dense with legal language, but the human element was there too. An independent fund, continuing education for workers, legal support for contract employees who claimed wrongful termination, and mechanisms for regular public reporting. It extended the temporary measures into permanent architecture. He looked up at Alexandra and saw authenticity in her eyes. She had learned, he could tell, how inexpensive gestures could be mistaken for real restoration. She had learned the cost of relying on reputations. The choice she offered now was not to marry her in private to bind a promise, but to marry the promise itself to the architecture of the company. They sat in silence for a moment that felt like a closing chord. "Will you help me make sure this is done right?" she asked. Bernard considered. He had not wanted to become anyone's instrument, yet here was an offer that put his condition into the language of systems and not the grammar of private obligation. To accept was not to enter a romantic contract. It was to step into public work with a partner who had real influence and was willing to bind it to law. "I will help," he said, "but not as someone's signature. I'll join the council as a founding member and help oversee the rollout. We do this publicly. No NDAs that silence people. No private settlements that erase names. If we're going to call this change, we live by it." They shook hands. It was not a marriage. It was a covenant of different shape, public, structural, and mutual. Still, the temptation of a personal bond lingered in both their chests. There were small afternoons in coffee shops where they spoke not as CEO and janitor, but as human beings who had been altered by a violent moment of near loss. There were dinners with Molly and Janet and Fiona, small and awkward and sincere. But Bernard remained careful. He had seen what the world could do to a man who became a symbol. He would not accept a marriage that would be read as a gratuity and then used to silence him. Months after the signs in the ink, the trustees' first report was issued. It found systemic failures in the company's initial response and recommended sanctions for executives who had worked to craft a narrative of blame without thorough inquiry. Tyler's role in encouraging aggressive protection of the brand was documented.
The board moved to accept some of the trustees' recommendations, including the naming of an independent ombudsperson, the funding of the Employee Welfare Trust, and the creation of permanent worker seats on the Oversight Council. There was no cinematic firing, no tidy villain punishment in a single headline. There was, instead, resignations, retirements, and a restocking of governance with people who had worked in community law and labor advocacy. Change is like that sometimes. Half the work of undoing bad systems is quietly replacing them. Bernard continued to show up. He spoke at town halls and helped draft training modules. He was appointed to the Oversight Council with an explicit mandate to ensure that the protections applied to contract workers and to help design the quick response processes that would prevent another instant smear from deciding someone's life. He became, in other words, one of the architects of the system he had demanded. The public's appetite for drama softened into a tedious thirst for updates. Once the initial scandal cooled, the long work of oversight became less interesting to some. But for people whose lives had been on the line, the slow mechanisms mattered. A neighborhood mother whose hours had been cut found help to keep her lights on. A security guard who had been denied a hearing was reinstated. A cleaner who had been offered a paltry settlement decades earlier got more serious review. As months became a year, something subtly astonishing happened. Bernard's existence in public life lost its sensational angle and became normal. He was no longer the janitor who saved the CEO as a headline. He was Bernard, a father and a council member who went to meetings and read budgets and made sure workers were at the table. That normalization was perhaps the truest vindication. As for the marriage that had been offered in a moment of grief and guilt, it remained an artifact of that extraordinary day, a flash that had forced an act into being, but not the endgame. Alexandra and Bernard never married. The proposal had functioned in the end, less as a romantic turning point and more as a detonator for accountability. That was exactly what Bernard had demanded and what she had agreed to. Power repurposed in the architecture rather than made into a private guardianship. There were, however, seasons of friendship. Alexandra visited the community center and sat in chairs that sometimes smelled of coffee and old paint. She wept once at a fundraiser when a mother spoke about the difference a small stipend had made during a winter when her heating had failed. Bernard, seated nearby, felt no romantic tug. He felt the work of repair and the warmth of seeing someone safe. They sometimes dined together with Molly and Janet and spoke of children and soccer practice and the strange way life bends when a single act changes everything.
The final tableau, one that would be used in future retellings, was not the proposal on stage, but a quieter, less cinematic image. Bernard walking with Molly down a busy street on the day she started a new school, with a little backpack and a big grin. He had a new job title in his email signature and a steady paycheck in his bank. He still hummed to himself sometimes, and Molly hummed right back. A plaque on the community center read, Visible Work Initiative, Incorporated, and in small letters underneath was the list of founding supporters, including Alexandra's company and the independent trustee. The Oversight Council had convened its first public review, and the city had taken notice. When people asked Bernard about that day in the boardroom, he spoke simply. I did what I could do, he would say. I put my hands where they were needed. That was it. What mattered afterward was what people chose to do with that moment. Some chose to hide behind it. Others chose to change. We did the hard part. Alexandra, years later, would sometimes visit the small apartment where Bernard had once lived to check on Molly's school progress. She would bring flowers or sometimes a loaf of bread. She never again made a public proposal. She learned to make promises that could be counted and audited, and in doing so, she found a deeper meaning to the word accountability than she'd ever expected. Tyler's name became an example in management seminars about what not to do when a crisis becomes moral. The company, bruised and chastened, began to hire managers who could speak public good as fluently as they could speak profit. It wasn't a perfect story. No system is perfect. But the thing that had begun as a gesture, an impulsive, flawed plea, became a hinge for procedural change. Bernard's demand had reframed the moment into something durable, a binding promise, an oversight council that could veto wrongful terminations, and an employee welfare fund that materially supported families. In the end, the story that mattered was small and steady. It wasn't the chest-thumping drama of a billionaire marrying a janitor. It was a father, a daughter, and a neighborhood being offered something like relief and choosing together to make sure others would be seen as they had been seen. You're not invisible anymore, people told Bernard in after meetings, and he felt the phrase move through him like a salve. On a warm evening, as autumn moved toward winter, the Oversight Council held its first community fair to celebrate the program's first year. There were booths with health checks, a table distributing warm coats, and a small stage where workers told their stories. Molly sold lemonade to raise money for school supplies, and Janet manned a table with hand-knitted hats. Alexandra stood in the back, watching the crowd, and she approached Bernard with a small smile and no petitions that needed signatures.
She simply said, low and unadorned, "Thank you for making me do the harder thing." Bernard looked at the faces around him, people whose lives were threaded into the fabric of a neighborhood,
and then at Alexandra. He felt no need to be a symbol. He was a man who had been called to act, and who had insisted that the act be scaled into justice. "That's not the thanks I need," he said quietly. "Keep them visible." She nodded, and together they stepped into a noisy, ordinary crowd, where the work of being human, of keeping promises, of minding children, of being accountable, went on, one breath at a time. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who believes institutions can be built to protect dignity. If you want to learn more about worker advocacy groups or support local programs that help frontline workers, check the links in the description and consider donating or volunteering. Stories begin with one person seeing another. Lasting change begins when systems learn to do the same.